Gita, what a pleasure to see you here at the World Economic Forum.
Hi, Wei. It's a pleasure to join you.
Earlier, last year, there were some predictions coming from IMF suggesting 1/3 of the global economies might be having the danger of running into the possibility of recession. But now, I know things have been evolving. What is your latest assessment?
So in October, Wei, what we had said was that 1/3 of the world would likely be in recession either in 22 or in 23. So we're going to have new numbers come out at the end of January. They will actually be in the ballpark. The overall numbers will be in the ballpark of what we had put out in October. But several things have changed since October, which is that we had better than expected growth, for instance, in the US and in Europe. In the case of China, of course, the last quarter of the year was tough because we had the big surge in infections and you had the restrictions that were put in place. But now the country has moved decisively away from zero COVID. We're seeing cases going up, and of course that there is the consequences of that. But as the wave subsides, we expect China's economy to rebound relatively quickly this year.
What about the relatively quickly you are describing? Exactly what you meant.
So I think the first quarter of this year, you would have the consequences of COVID running through the economy. But then the expectation is that the infections will die out, people will return much more to economic activity, mobility will go up, consumption spending will recover some more, and so then we would see that return in growth. But that said, there is the other aspect which also matters for China's growth prospects, which is the property sector. It's a very important part of China's economy. There is stress in that sector, and the government has taken a lot of concrete actions to deal with it, but still, investment is weak, and that weakness will affect the growth numbers.
You probably heard from the Vice Premier talking about the commitments that China is making and has been making. In his words, it seems to come out very strongly about economic development remains the key goal of China, the most important goal, and also reform and opening up. It's not a political slogan, but rather a commitment to show what China is thinking through right now. So Gita, on this, how much do you see official recognition of some of the important principles that China has been holding on to for the past 4 decades now could have an impact on economic growth or others' confidence about China?
The remarks of the Vice Premier very welcome. I think it's given a lot of positive sentiment also in Davos about China returning back to the global economy, reconnecting back strongly. We will, of course, wait and see what exactly will those actions be and what will be announced. But those are very hopeful signs.
He talked about the property market, of course, and also the financial support for the property market. He also talked about the entrepreneurship, how it should be respected everywhere in the world. And there are a list of other things that he touched on, especially also on the structural reforms and better quality, China's way of modernization. Now, to you, those seem to be, phrases with Chinese characteristics. But to you, what really matters now you see with China coming to seek once again as the engine of the global growth?
So firstly, I think it's very important that we see China in these kinds of conferences and meetings in person as opposed to on screen. I think that makes a big difference.
I haven't seen you for about 5 years, I think.
Yes, indeed. I think that makes a big difference for diplomacy also, given the importance of China on the global stage. We've been of the view that Chinese growth needs to move to be more consumption-driven as opposed to investment-driven. And if we see that happening, that will be a positive sign. Again, a more level playing field for state-owned enterprises and for the private sector. I mean, again, the Vice Premier made several very positive comments in that direction.
Straightforward way.
Yeah.
On the other hand, what about the economy in the U.S.? You earlier warned in some of your articles that it's still too early for the Federal Reserve to claim, quote-unquote, successful. Now, what about your assessment now, and what do you see are the major challenges for the U.S. economy?
So we are seeing inflation coming down. We think headline inflation has likely peaked. Now, core inflation, which is the headline inflation excluding energy and food, that has also been coming down, and we saw some moderation in wage growth. So I think the inflation readings in the last couple of months have provided some hope that we may be durably bringing inflation down, but I would wait for another 2-3 months of data before one can feel really sure that this will be the case. So our advice to the Federal Reserve remains that you should stay the course on monetary policy, keep it restrictive to bring inflation down durably.
Earlier last year, at the end of it, we saw the G20 summit and also the APEC economic leaders meeting. There are some consensus being reached then, but of course we all know words translating into action could be another different thing. So from your observation, what about those consensus to the IMF? What are the most important ones?
I think it was very heartening to see the meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping at the Leaders Summit in November, at the G20 Leaders Summit. I think that was, for all of the delegations around there, it was a bit of a positive sentiment, because what it meant was that, you have to put a floor on that relationship. You can't afford it to completely unravel. These are the two largest economies of the world. It matters for the rest of the world if they work together or if they don't work together. So I think that from the IMF's perspective, it is very heartening to see that collaboration happen. We need, China to play a very important role when it comes to global trade, reform of the WTO, when it comes to debt and debt resolution, climate. It has a very important role to play, and providing that collaborative spirit, I think, is very important.
And what about Europe? Of course, we are seeing that Europe is having more of its own identity in a way, and more in urgency of trying to come up with solutions of problems of their own. So how do you see the role of European economies and the state of it?
So Europe got hit very hard by the war, especially because of the big rise in gas prices, and countries that were dependent on it, energy costs went up. So that had a very big negative effect on the economy. That said, thanks to the milder winter, and also because they were very good about getting energy from other parts of the world, they have a good amount of storage of gas right now. So I think that the worst that we might have worried about has receded. Uncertainty remains, risk remains, but again, we were surprised somewhat positively because of these outcomes on how the European economy is doing.
I always wonder, as an economist like you working for the IMF, a lot of people are listening to your words very carefully, and they're planning their life in a way, your economy according to what you have in your mind. But it is such a transition from a few years ago when we were still talking about globalization. And we were not seeing a very fragmented world, even though there are differences as always, to now it's a very different world, apparently.
Yes.
And we don't know where it's heading for. So how do you see your research amid all these uncertainties?
Everybody's more concerned about economic security and national security concerns. You do have rising tensions between the US and China that has grown over the last 3-4 years. All of this is making us worry about the world fragmenting and decoupling. And we know that's going to be very costly if that happens. Now, it's important for countries to diversify where they buy from. It's important for countries to have more supply chain resilience. I think that's absolutely the case. National security is important. But the risk is every country decides that they're going to do all their production at home and disengage from the world. And we just know that then will put more cost pressures on households and on firms, and will be a net negative for the global economy.
Yeah. Another question about China, if I can. The confidence for domestic consumption is going to be very crucial for China, particularly if China wants to have its own structural reforms, so to speak, that is not relying on exports but more on domestic consumption. Do you see in that regard there are rising certainties that Chinese consumers might be more interested in consuming and not blindly consuming? I know you've been away from China for 3 years, but I know you are doing constant research about the economy.
Yes, no, we pay very close attention to China. So indeed, consumption growth, private sector consumption growth has not recovered fully. It hasn't come back in the strength we would have liked to see. The reopening will help, but we've also been of the view that it's important to have stronger social safety nets in China, because one of the reasons savings rates are so high is because you don't have that safety net. And so, I mean, our advice has been that maybe there could be more scope for fiscal policy to be used for social safety nets as opposed to just investment and infrastructure.
Once again, I want to have a question about the U.S. as well. The U.S. dollar has been the dominating currency in our world. There are a lot of questions and debates about whether that should still be the way. Of course, at this moment, the reality shows it is still. So how do you see, as an economist, the nature of these debates and where is it heading for?
I mean, there is a reason why certain currencies become dominant currencies. We've had this historically, right? Before the world wars, it was the British pound. After the world wars, it's the US dollar. The strength of the institutions, the strength of monetary policy making, the strength of fiscal policy making, the trust in the institutions is absolutely critical to whether a currency becomes a major currency in the global economy. And there are what we call network effects, which is that it helps if all of us are using sometimes the same currency, right? So there is value to that. And the dollar plays a very important role at this point. I know that in the middle of last year, there was this concern that the dollar was appreciating so strongly relative to other currencies that could have negative consequences for other parts of the world. There is some of that, but you know, the last couple of months, the dollar has depreciated by around 10% on average. So it depends upon, you know, what's happening in the rest of the world. It depends. You know, the Fed has raised interest rates quite a bit and will likely do some more, but not at the same pace.
Gita, what a pleasure to see you once again. All the best.
Thank you.